everyone, and welcome to Booming Encore's Learning Bites. My name is Susan Williams, and I'm the founder of Booming Encore. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Martin Hyde, Associate Professor in Gerontology from Swansea University. In one of our previous sessions, Martin shared some research on how well people were making the transition into retirement. And today he's back with us to discuss some recent research that he's published on whether group-based courses can assist people in making these types of transitions later in life. So welcome, Martin.
Welcome. Thank you again for having me back, an opportunity to talk about the work we've been doing.
Terrific. Well, glad to have you. So why don't we just start off with, what was the primary purpose of this research that you actually did?
Well, like you said, it was to look at evaluating a number of courses that took a more what you call a psychosocial approach to retirement planning or sort of late life planning, and that moved away from just thinking about it as a financial consideration. So to try to think about what sort of hobbies, social activities that you might want to be planning or thinking about as you start to approach the possibility of retiring, or even thinking about working longer, and what things you might need to put in place in order to have the opportunities that you wanted later in life.
Terrific. And what were some of the major findings you found?
So we looked at a whole range of different what we call outcomes, so things that the funder and the supporting organisations were interested in. So some very sort of practical issues around whether people felt they were clear in what sort of goals that they wanted. So obviously, like I said, the purpose of the courses was to get people to reflect more about more than just their financial goals, so things about what hobby and leisure activities they might want to be involved in. Also, broader issues around things like people's quality of their social network. So did they have the sort of friend group around them that was going to enable them to do the things they want to do, or did they have those people in their lives that drained them from energy and prevented them from doing the sort of things that they wanted to do? And overall, we found that the courses were very positive, that people came away with, in general, clearer ideas about their goals, that people's well-being, so that was another big issue that what people were interested in, went up, which was really positive. Though we did find some potentially contradictory findings. So the quality of people's social relationships went down, which gave us kind of some pause for concern. We think, well, why would this be the case? But when we looked at some of the interviews that we did, so we did both a survey, so we got some quantitative information for a number of times before the course started and 3 times after the course. We supplemented that with interviews as well, so trying to get behind the numbers. We found that it really wasn't that all of a sudden people's social networks had changed, but it was that people's understanding or appreciation of those networks had changed. And whereas initially we thought it was a negative finding, people getting worse social contacts, actually I think it was a positive one, that people began to identify potentially toxic relationships and hopefully do something about those. We were also interested to see what types of people, or whether different types of people benefited more or less from the course. So we did a very sort of crude approach to that. We just said, well, when you start the course, are you already doing okay, or are you sort of in the bottom part of the population, really? So people that are sort of struggling a little bit. And we sort of hypothesized that if the courses worked, we thought they did work, in terms of the general evidence that we got, then they should probably work more for those people that had the greatest need of them, the people that were struggling the most. And it was quite reassuring to find out was the case for almost all of the outcomes. People that went in with the lowest well-being, people that went in with, we had these measures of like self-kindness and self-compassion, so how much you sort of looked after yourself. So people that were less good at doing that actually were the ones that came out with the greatest improvements. The only one where we found that wasn't the case was kind of attitudes to aging. So people that had more negative attitudes to aging when they started tended to see less of an improvement in that, whereas people who are already, if you like, on message about thinking positively about aging seemed to do a little bit better than that. So it was overall positive, but there were some interesting sort of counterintuitive findings as well.
And what I found was really interesting is that of the participants, 90% were actually women. And I mean, you're well aware there's a lot of challenges for men specifically as they transition into this. Do you think the results would have been different if the population was, a different balance at all?
Undoubtedly. And the reason that they were all predominantly women is because, and I probably should have said at the start of the conversation, was that the original plan had been to evaluate this course across a number of different organisations or different areas. So they weren't all based in workplaces. Some of them were in the community, some of them were with particular groups like long-term unemployed. But unfortunately, a number of those other courses didn't recruit sufficient people into their program, so we weren't able to include them in the study. But what we ended up with were the two main course providers, which were luckily for us from a kind of a research perspective, were both in the healthcare sector. So we really felt confident we could kind of bring these two groups together to get a sufficiently large number of people to be able to do the analysis. But, and I'm sure this is the same in Canada, as it is, I think, in most countries, is that the workforce in the healthcare sector is predominantly female. So we just, by doing the research in that context, we got mostly women in the study. So in that sense, it's representative of the healthcare sector, but of course we're missing men in the healthcare sector, but in general. And as you say, there are different challenges that men face. There are different approaches as well. I mean, one of the kind of consistent findings that we reported in the previous piece of research that you and I discussed on the kind of the general evidence on approaching retirement is that men do tend to plan better for retirement, but that planning tends to be overwhelmingly financial.
Yeah.
So it would have been interesting in this context where the financial was part of it, or financial planning was part of it, but not predominantly. And we do know, again, from lots of other studies, that men tend to suffer most in terms of losing social networks and social contact when they leave work, because work tends to be a bigger part of their lives, or rather they tend not to have as many friends out of work than they do in work. So I think, I mean, we'd definitely be very keen to try to find other opportunities to do this in a more, I don't know, gender mixed workplace, or even a more male dominated workplace, like something like manufacturing or kind of construction. And that would be very interesting to kind of see where that works. Because again, if we go by the findings from this study, which those groups that seem to need it most do best from it, then thinking about planning for those sorts of psychosocial well-being outcomes that men might not necessarily think about when they think about retirement planning could have a really, you know, a much bigger kind of positive effect than, let's say, a group that already work in those sort of compassionate industries that already may be thinking about some of those other things.
So true. And what I also found was really interesting in the research was that even though the primary audience, for instance, was female, that 90% of them actually went home and spoke with their spouses or partners after the workshop. So at that point, they started engaging, you know, their other partners. Do you think this only happened as a result of this workshop, or do you think they had some conversations before this workshop, or did this possibly trigger that? What do you think?
I mean, so in the questionnaire, we explicitly asked, have you done anything new since the workshops? But we were trying to pick up on new occurrences or new events. So we asked about talking to your spouse, but we also asked about talking to friends, talking to your employer. We also asked about whether you like change your habits, your diet, your exercise. So we tried to capture a lot of things that people might do once they start to reflect on this, like, oh, you know, maybe I do need to start doing a bit more X, or maybe I should look after myself a bit better, and that. So there were a number of things, but certainly the importance of, or research has definitely shown the importance of talking to significant others around major life changes, and that's not just retirement and leaving work, it's anything you do. These are key, you know, partners in that. And you know, we know that when people don't really communicate, that's when problems arise, and if there's miscommunication, particularly around major life changes, and that's where there's, you know, opportunities for increased tension. So we were hoping that we caught new events, and it certainly seemed to be the case that was what we got. Again, when we looked at the qualitative, the interview data, that's what people were telling us, because for many of them it was the first time they had thought about it. And again, we have to understand, it's important to understand the context here. So these are healthcare professionals across a whole range of grades, but they're people who put a lot of themselves in their work. They're people who care for others, and they often talked about taking that sort of caring role back into the family. So their needs often weren't first or even second in their sort of list of priorities. So to have that time, a lot of them were telling us to have that time to go away and really reflect, well, what do I want? What plans do I have? Was for them quite revelationary. And some of them,
now, I know that these were actually the results out of a group setting. Do you think people could do this and have the same sort of results also independently, or is this something that you see there's value in actually doing it in a group?
So that was a question we asked the course providers as well, and not just the courses that we've ended up finally sort of evaluating, but when we started off, that was a question that we wanted to ask all 6 of the providers. And overwhelmingly, their response was that there is a value added in the group-based nature of this. And a number of them had run similar courses online, but there was something about that sharing and about that being able to discuss this with others in the same situation. And again, that comes through, I think, in some of the interviews that we did with participants, that they had often thought that these problems were theirs alone. This is me. I'm not thinking about it. It's a personal issue, while not realizing that actually it's something that everyone's sort of going through. Like, people who've given 20, 30 years of their life to work, like I said, in these very sort of emotionally and psychologically demanding jobs that haven't really given themselves the space to think about themselves, and all of a sudden they're moving towards a huge, like you said, a huge change in life where you've gone from working 8-10 hours a day to not doing that, and not really sort of talking about it. And again, some of the accounts in the interviews about how people felt about the courses, but also talking sort of incidentally to the course providers, there was almost sort of a sort of pseudo therapeutic sense to some of the group sessions where people actually sort of supported each other as well. And I think, from other research I've done in another life, if you like, around sort of work environment and health, so just looking not specifically at older workers, but how your working conditions improve or detract from your health, we know that having good co-worker support is really vital for good health. Mm-hmm. So again, these courses offered opportunities for people to really talk to their co-workers, again, for a job where you don't really get a lot of downtime. This was really valuable for a lot of people.
It probably also really emphasized the whole social interaction thing and the necessity for it as well. I'm sure, given that that was probably one of the topics that was discussed. So to actually have that experience there probably really kind of helped to reinforce it, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, and so again, one of the big take homes, I think, from all of this was communication. Sort of talking to people, talking to your co-workers, talking to your manager, helping you to understand what it is you want. So again, not kind of thinking this is a purely individual thing. I think there's a tendency for us to think of retirement or any life transition as a purely individual choice, and I think that's important. We have to have choice about what we do, and that's really important. But we don't make choices in complete isolation. Our choices affect others, and other people's choices affect us. So having those open conversations with people who are going to be affected by your decisions, who are going to affect your decisions, is really vital. And that's not just in that very, small bubble of the family, but co-workers. I think about my own workplace. These are people who I see 4 or 5 times a week, who I probably spend as much time with as my partner. So, leaving them is, a big issue as well. And particularly if you think about a job where you've worked for half your life or more, those are big social relations to move away from. And so talking to people about that, and also, like I said, what sort of came out of the participants' reflections on the value of the group-based nature, just by talking to people, it helps you to clarify your own goals, or at least to realize that it's okay not to have super clear goals about what you want to do. It's a process to work through.
And it is a process, as you mentioned, and it does take time. And not necessarily it's all done in like one workshop, as you said, but at least it starts that thought process, and then hopefully you kind of develop a network while you're in the program to possibly help continue some of that dialogue. Now, a lot of employers aren't offering any of these types of workshops. Do you think there's some value in them actually doing this?
Definitely. I mean, a lot of employers do offer kind of some retirement planning workshops, but again, they tend to be very financially. Yeah. So that's important. I'm not ever going to say money isn't important. Get your finances right, everybody. That's something you need to definitely look at. But it's not the whole thing. And again, I think often the value of having good finances in retirement is so you can do the things you want to do, not just to sit and look at a big pile of money or your bank balance and be happy. So it's important, but it's important to have these discussions about the wider issues. But I can see why, there's a potential tension and why employers might be reluctant to offer these, because it might seem like you're encouraging people to think about leaving work through retirement. But actually we found that the participants really valued this and valued the fact that they felt valued by their employer, like their employer was caring for them. So these were people in their sort of, from 50 to 60, early 60s. So they weren't imminently about to retire. And it sent a positive message to them, like your employer is thinking about you, and it's thinking about your well-being beyond your formal contract with them. And I think there's lots of evidence now that shows that sort of image of the positive, of the kind of supportive employer, has massive sort of ripple effects throughout the entire workforce. So even if you're not in that age bracket where you're thinking about retirement, and let's say you're in your 30s, let's say you're even in your 20s, when you're starting to work for an employer, and you think, well, this employer is going to look after me. They're sending out the right signals. They're going to be sort of an employer that is going to be interested in my well-being whilst I'm at work, because they're interested in my well-being when I've left work.
Yes.
We actually did get we got a number of participants who said, actually, I'm going to give back to the employer. This has made me feel valued by the employer. And there was a quote that I'm trying to search for, but basically said, I'm going to go back and give 110% now because I feel like I'm really valued. And we know the flip side of that. We know that when you don't feel that your employer is looking out for you, we know that when you feel that your employer is just only interested in the maximum amount that they can get out of you over a short period, people don't put as much in. People do hold it back. And again, I think it's about creating those kind of compassionate organizations, because then that creates to support compassionate workers. And we know that's good for well-being and productivity as well, because people don't go off on sickness absence, or people support people when they can't do work. So you build that overall kind of value. So I think that more good employers will start doing this. And I think there's been certainly in the UK, I know in some parts of Canada, and I think in the US as well, there's been this big push around what we call age-friendly workplaces. And a lot of that has been focused on sort of maintaining workers in work in terms of things like desk design and ergonomics and good hiring practices. But I think things like this could become an integral part of age-friendly workplaces. Even though it might seem about supporting people to leave work, that still feeds into making people feel valued while they're at work.
Yeah, and it could also be tied in with like specific programs, like flexible work options. We know is very much of interest, or part-time options, or all of those things could actually be built into somebody's longer-term retirement plan if the employers got more engaged, I think, as well, in having these conversations and actually showing that they
absolutely
that they care. So to wrap this all up, as a result of this research, if you could give 3 things that you would suggest people really take a look at, around making this transition, what would you tell them?
Talk to people. So I think that's absolutely number one. Whoever it might be, start to have those conversations. Don't worry if you don't completely clear in your head what they are, because it's a process. So beginning to sort of think about that. Get a hobby would be number 2. That seems to be sort of the big thing that people don't sort of think about. So you have something else to be working on to kind of give that sense of purpose that you want to do when you start to retire, and start it before you retire as well. I think that seems to be one of the other big things. The rate of uptake of new hobbies after retirement is quite low. But the rate of continuity or continuing to do hobbies once you retire is quite high. It's something that people sort of get into and then continue to do. And thirdly, surround yourself with people that are going to help you make good choices. So again, whether that's co-workers, talking to them and supporting them, but also sort of people outside of work as well. And again, I think we saw that with the results on the sort of quality of social relations. But that seems to be a really important thing. I think, if you're thinking again about what's going to happen when you sort of leave work, there's a chance that you might no longer, or it might be harder for you to keep those social connections you have at work, so you can be more reliant on those social networks you have outside of work. If they're not positive, if they're not the people that you want to be around, they're going to help you have the kind of later life that you want, then probably a good time to start thinking about what you want that friendship network to look like when you retire.
Absolutely. Some great advice. Well, thanks so much for your time, Martin. As always, really appreciate it. And for everyone out there, hope you found this information valuable and it helps you live your best booming encore. Bye for now, everyone.